I'm sitting in front of my own shirt, so. You leave on July 1st?
No, we leave a little before that.
I tell you what, can you all switch places?
Oh, sure.
Because the camera is
Okay,
better focused on this one.
I've already spilled coffee.
that's okay.
Don't get it on the book.
Good morning. Well, welcome. This is going to be an exciting day and an exciting presentation. You might notice that there on your chairs there is a 3x5 card with a pen. So if you want to ask a question, you can write it on there and we'll collect them before the question and answer time. And also make sure your phones are silenced. So welcome to our live stream guests and our in-person guests. We have a very interesting crowd here. I'm Nina McLemore, and I want to welcome everyone. You may go to our YouTube page anytime and see the interviews that we've conducted already. So what they are: Susan Page on Madam Speaker about Nancy Pelosi, Lynn Olson on Madame Fourcade's Secret War, which if you haven't read it is fascinating. Dan Glickman, who's a former congressman and secretary of agriculture, who happens to be the brother of Sharon Glickman, who is with us on his book, Laughing at Myself. And today it's our third book signing on strong women. There's a message here. The authors are almost all women, and they are our clients. And the subjects are really interesting women whom history has often overlooked. So, although I don't think history will overlook Nancy Pelosi. So first we have Karen Tumulty, who is our author. I think it's interesting that she was born in San Antonio, Texas. She went to UT, that's University of Texas, not University of Tennessee, and she earned her MBA at Harvard. So she went from Texas to the East Coast, liberal East Coast, right? She's a political columnist for the Washington Post, and she received the Toner Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting. Before joining the Post, she wrote for Time magazine, and this is her first book. Ruth Marcus, whom almost all of you probably know, is the deputy editorial page editor for the Washington Post, where she also writes a weekly column. She's a graduate of Harvard Law School and has been, she's covered campaign finance, Justice Department, Supreme Court, and the White House. And she's the author of Supreme Ambition, about the background of Justice Kavanaugh's confirmation, which is quite interesting, particularly for those of us who don't know how the process works. I read 3 newspapers every day. And since in my 20s, I've lived in New York and have been an avid reader of the New York Times. I now tell my husband he cannot read the Post until I finish with it, because I think it is the newspaper of America. It covers what's going on in this country. It covers what is happening in the government that affects all of our lives. And I think that the journalists and the op-ed writers are all excellent. So there's no longer a fight in the morning. My husband has accepted that I have to read the Post first. So if you want to understand Ronald Reagan and his presidency, you really need to read this book about Nancy. She was complex, she was fascinating, she was very smart, she was forceful, decisive, and she was beautiful. And of course, from my point of view, she also had a great sense of style. She, like all strong women, frankly, she's been vilified by the press and by some of her, people who knew her. But now, finally, I think she's being recognized for her contributions to his presidency, his presidency, and the country. The literally made in Hollywood marriage of Ronald and Nancy Reagan is an incredibly strong love story. It's the partnership that made him president. Without Nancy, I would say that Ronald Reagan would not ever have been president. Of the pair, Nancy was the one with the sharper instincts about people, the superior radar for trouble, and a great fundraiser. She had the keen sense of how to secure his place in history, and she also totally believed in and was very protective of Ronald. She was crucial in shaping the White House team because she was the one who identified the people who were totally loyal to him and really out for his benefit and not their own. And people who got things done and people who were smart. She played a crucial role in softening her husband's rhetoric and pushing him toward what she saw as his grandest purpose, to leave behind a more peaceful world, including rapprochement with the Soviet Union. Then she took care of the love of her life for 10 years as his Alzheimer's progressed. And then after that, for the next 10 or 15 years that she was alive, she was at the library and making sure that the library was funded and that it would be a good reflection of his presidency. Next, we have we're going from the Cold War to the civil rights, and we have Karen Gray Houston, whose uncle was the main legal force and main organizer for the bus boycotts in 1955, and her father, who was younger, who helped organize the boycotts, and became a lawyer himself and practiced civil rights law in Ohio. So, and then after that, we have more coming. We haven't decided whether we should do them in July and August or whether we should give it a break. But we have a lot of, it's interesting, we have a lot of clients who are authors and writing really interesting books. So I give it to Ruth and Karen.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. I just want to say I'm triply pleased to be here. I'm first, honestly, aren't we all pleased to be anywhere?
Yes.
After all of that time. Second of all, there's nobody who it's more fun to talk to, though I've never interviewed you before, than Karen, who has been my gal pal, my campaign trail buddy, and my colleague for more years than we care to talk about, and who has just written an absolutely fabulous, compelling book. I was talking to somebody the other day who was saying, I didn't think I was going to be interested, but I was, because as Nina says, you can't understand the Reagan presidency without fully understanding Nancy Reagan. And to understand what a good book this is, I'm going to quote a really excellent source who spoke very briefly it was actually one of the first times people from the newsroom had gotten together in one of our colleagues' backyards. Don Graham, whose mother, Catherine, had weekly lunches.
Well, not frequent,
lunches,
very frequent,
lunches,
yeah.
with Nancy Reagan, said, I thought I knew everything about Nancy Reagan, and Karen Tumulty's book taught me things that I didn't know, and he had a front row seat to that presidency and that person, that first lady. And it's actually particularly apt that Karen and I are here because this is an actual true story. We were at a dinner talk. I can't remember who it was by, at someone's house, and it was question time. And Nina raised her hand and said, I didn't know who this very attractive woman was. And she says, I'm Nina McLemore. Karen and I were both there. You would have thought, I'm going to use a Nancy Reagan era comparison. You would have thought that Frank Sinatra was in the room. We were swooning. Oh my God, it's Nina McLemore. It's Nina McLemore. Should we? Because we were both aficionados of Nina McLemore's clothes because they look great on people, but they also look great on television. And so we came to express our fandom afterwards, and we ended up here spending way more money than we had anticipated with a bunch of our friends on an excellent shopping spree in the before times. So it's great. It's super great to be here at this wonderful store that makes us all look better in person and on television than we have any right to look. Just to see Karen's beautiful thing. Karen, do you want to say something before we get started?
Sure. As this book took me 4.5 years, and all along the way, people kept asking, why Nancy Reagan? And again, it was my first book. It was not my idea. My publisher and my editor at Simon & Schuster came to me a few months after she died in 2016 and said, we'd like a big biography of Nancy Reagan. And I am such an astute analyst of politics. I thought, Hillary Clinton's going to be a really conventional president. Maybe I'll need an outside project. So that's how I ended up having a book deal. But it turned out to be, her story was so much more compelling than I thought it was. I mean, she really was one of our most controversial first ladies in modern history. A lot of her problems she brought on herself because she had her flaws, she had her demons, and this book does not flinch from those. But as I would do the research, I would begin to understand how both she and Ronald Reagan were the products of very difficult, painful childhoods. And when they met, they completely filled in the voids of each other's personalities, that they filled the needs of each other. They offered a kind of security and stability that neither of them had ever known. And as James Baker, Nina made reference to this, he needed her for other reasons too. Ronald Reagan, as is not unusual for the adult child of an alcoholic, was very conflict averse. He wanted to trust everybody around him. He was a delegator. He just didn't like a lot of the things that are sort of endemic to politics. And it was really Nancy who, as James Baker, their first White House chief of staff and later their Treasury secretary, told me, she had terrific instincts and about people and much better than his. And while she had modeled herself and presented herself to the country as a very traditional wife, somebody who was the scorn of feminism, and she rarely set foot in the West Wing, everybody who worked there knew when she was unhappy about something, and people who were not in her good graces tended not to last for very long. She is a major reason that Ronald Reagan went through no fewer than 6 national security advisors. But other people in the administration who really understood her power, who understood the fact that she was literally the only person on the planet to whom Ronald Reagan was truly close, understood how important an ally she could be. This was the case with George Shultz, the Secretary of State, as one of the things she believed in most deeply was that she really did want to see her husband go down as a peacemaker and wanted to see the end of the Cold War and didn't want his legacy and history to be as some sort of hip-shooting cowboy from the West. But people who understood that, James Baker understood that she was truly the most powerful ally they could have. Baker told me, if you could convince her that something was in the best interests of the president, you had a very good shot at getting him on board too. And so what I finally realized that for all of her complexity, for all of her flaws, she was precisely the partner that Ronald Reagan needed. And she was also way overdue, I thought, for a reassessment. The other thing, though, that I think I keep returning to again and again and again in the book is that there was collateral damage to this very close relationship that these two people had. And the damage tended to fall upon their children. As Patty Davis, her daughter, said at her funeral, it was like the two of them were such a closed circle that everyone else just floated around outside of it. And that was, I think that was in many ways the greatest pain of her life. She wrote in her own memoir, all I ever wanted was to be a good wife and a good mother, and I guess I succeeded more at one than at the other. And the dedication of her memoir is to Ronnie, who always understood, and to my children, who I hope will understand. So again, it really made her such a complex character. Her life was so cinematic, whether it was a childhood where, people like Spencer Tracy and, Lillian Gish, the most famous actors and actresses, were sort of floating around her, or this completely unexpected story of how these two met. And certainly when Ronald Reagan shows up on her doorstep in 1949 for what he thinks is a blind date, it turns out she'd been trying for months to get their paths to cross. Nobody could have imagined what lay ahead for this actress who's about to lose her contract at MGM, and this actor who has been, his first wife walked out on him because essentially she got bored with him. His career is coming to an end, and both of them, as I said, carrying the scars of very difficult childhoods with them.
Great. Well, we're done. That was a brilliant. No, that was a brilliant summary of this wonderful book. I'm wondering if you can go back to the beginning and talk about what made you decide to just say yes when our joint editor Priscilla Payton came to you with the marvelous idea. Did you? For me, writing about Brett Kavanaugh, I had been looking for a book for, this is just a little roof plug, sorry. I had been looking for a book for some time to write because I hadn't written one, felt like it was something on my bucket list. And when the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings turned into something different than I expected, I knew that was the right book for me to write. When Priscilla came to you and said Nancy Reagan, was it immediately clear that this was a good match and a good use of your talents, or did it take a while? Talk about that.
Well, I had the same thing. I'd never written a book before. I didn't know if I could write a book
This is
before.
classic, right?
And it just seemed like a straightforward story. And the first person, a first lady book, I mean, what could be more simple? But the first person I called was not my husband. It was our publisher at the Washington Post, Fred Ryan, who also is chairman of the board of the Ronald Reagan Library. And I said, so is there anything to be said about her that hasn't been said? And he just said, long silence, oh yeah. And but I also must stipulate that at no point did he try to influence where the facts took me. I really tried to follow the facts. The reviews have been incredibly favorable. And while there is a lot in this book that is not flattering about her, that is in fact quite painful, the Reagan Library is not challenging a word, which...
More than that, they're inviting you, right?
Yeah, in fact, they've invited me to do a book signing out there on July 6th, which would have been her 100th birthday, although she would have told you it was her 98th.
And so tell us a little bit about the reporting process that you went through. How did you do that? How much was the documentary evidence in the library and elsewhere, and how much was the interviews that you've been able to do? And I wonder if the fact that she was no longer with us freed up some people to say things that they might have, even in her advancing age, been too scared to say.
Absolutely. I opened, and the other thing that was happening was that so many of the people who'd been around were either gone or of very advanced age. I opened the book with something George Shultz told me at the age of 97 about a dinner that she arranged right after he became Secretary of State. She sets up a private dinner so that he can hear her husband talk directly about the Soviet Union. Something Shultz did not imagine, that this man who was presiding over the biggest military build up in peacetime in U.S. history, who had decades of anti-communist rhetoric, who had stocked his administration with hardliners who believed there was no chance we could ever have a working relationship with the Soviet Union. Nancy knew she had to get Schultz away from all of that and let him listen to her husband. And so Schultz goes over to the White House thinking this is just a social dinner. And he suddenly realizes this was the whole reason she set it up. And he also realizes in this moment that she is going to be a crucial ally in all of it. So a lot of it was interviewing people for many, many hours. Her stepbrother just died a few weeks ago. He was incredibly helpful. He was probably the last living person who would have known her as a child, and just proving that no matter how old you get, sibling rivalry never dies. Richard Davis said to me not once but twice, he said, you know, if you want this to be a good book, you can't just write the nice things. and he could do things like confirm for me what I suspected, which is that her first fiance, who she broke up with, it was because she found out he was gay. And so he confirmed that, and I said, well, how did she know he was gay? Again, I'm talking to a 95-year-old man, long silence, and he says, well, I assume they had a sexual encounter, so anyway. So people were willing to talk to me, I think, about things that maybe they might not have, certainly while he was president or even while both Reagans were alive. There were an enormous number of tell-all books written during the Reagan presidency, most of which are out of print, but they were helpful. There are a lot of oral histories. I spent many, many weeks at the Reagan Library just going through documents. But what I didn't know about doing research at a presidential library is that there's stuff they have to show you, and there's a whole lot of really interesting stuff that they don't have to show you. What happens when a president leaves office is that an archivist from the National Archives goes through every piece of paper, and it is up to the archivist's independent judgment. Is this an official piece of paper, or is this personal? And if it's official, not all of it's been cataloged, but if you can do a FOIA, they have to show it to you. The personal stuff took me a couple of years of negotiations to get into, and they would at points send me in to a room by myself, and they would give me a pad, they would give me a pencil. I was not allowed to take pictures of it. And when I would leave, I would have to give them my notes, and then they would decide whether they would send me back my own notes. But that was where I found a lot of, that is where I went through her mother's diary, and a lot of, there was one box, and this stuff is not necessarily cataloged. I found one box full of just random stuff that they had taken out of her last residence. And mixed in with other stuff, I find a 4-page handwritten letter from Ronald Reagan begging his father-in-law, Nancy's father, on his deathbed Loyal Davis was an atheist. And Ronald Reagan writes this 4-page letter begging him to accept God before he dies and spelling out his own religious faith. There's another letter in the same box written.
And you hadn't realized before that the depth of President Reagan's, Ronnie, as you call him through the book, and that's an interesting decision, of his religious beliefs.
He really does. I mean, there's not a word crossed out in this 4-page letter, and he really does sort of describe why he believes what he believes. And I ended up writing a column about that for the Post. I went to the library and said, look, I don't want to wait for the book for this. I think it's historically important. So they gave me permission to reproduce that. But the same box had like a letter written in pencil by his mother in 1911, the year he was born. Another letter she wrote to friends in 1937 when he gets his first movie contract. And it was just extraordinary. And what happened, though, is I really wanted to go back to the library and keep digging, because there apparently are several boxes of letters between her and Prince Charles, where, among other things, Charles really lets down his hair about the divorce, and then COVID hit, so the library shut down. But they're there if somebody wants to go look for them.
Well, I guess we'll have the paperback.
Right.
You need to go get those.
I want them,
Yeah.
yes.
Said as an editor. I'm wondering if, did you ever meet Nancy Reagan?
I was in Washington in the 80s, but I covered one presidential vacation in Santa Barbara, and I know there was like a they did a little party for the press at somebody's ranch, not theirs, and there was a little grip and grin, but that would have been the only time.
Are there questions that, because I had the frustration of writing about a live person, so I'm not going to do that again. I want somebody to be dead.
Right.
But you had the frustration of writing about a dead person. Are there questions that you'd just be dying to ask her?
Yeah, to me, the fundamental conundrum I would love to ask her is how she could have been so shrewd and on the mark about her husband's image and so often so clueless about her own. I mean, going out and buying expensive china and redecorating the White House in the middle of the worst recession since the Great Depression, borrowing designer clothes and not giving them back. She would just do these things over and over and over again, even though when she was doing something in his interest, she was totally on the mark. It's amazing.
Do you have a theory of the case there? Because I'm going to bounce mine off of you.
I think part of it, a lot of this comes from Hollywood and appearances, and she also thought that she would be received the way Jackie Kennedy was when she redecorated the White House. Jackie Kennedy won an honorary Emmy for the show shown on all 3 networks, where she gives a guided tour of her also very expensive, and again, all of this is done with private donations, but very expensive renovation of the White House. I just don't.
So I thought as I was reading the book that yes, she had the Jackie Kennedy model, but it would have become pretty clear to her pretty quickly that for whatever reason, fair or unfair, was not going to work for her, and in particular the clothes were a problem. And though she tried to fix it with that famous secondhand clothes song that she appeared at the Gridiron Club, she never really did. And I was actually reminded, of all people, of Hillary Clinton as I was thinking about Nancy Reagan. And I was thinking about Nancy Reagan's very fraught and not always economically stable childhood. And then I was thinking about Hillary Clinton and the dumb things that she did. For example, the $100,000 that she made on commodities trading, just brilliant trading. And because Nancy Reagan, she almost had that Hillary Clinton worry about providing for herself and Ronnie, and I guess the family, even at the point where she, as you write about, even at the point where she left the White House and was worried about how they were going to be economically stable. And so I was wondering if that there was this kind of, from her childhood, economic insecurity that was underneath that. And I wanted to sort of use that as an opportunity for you to talk. You talked a little bit about Reagan's role, Ronnie's role as the child of a alcoholic, but her childhood, it seemed, really, really shaped her as well.
Yeah, I think it was economic instability, but it was also emotional instability. And, they ran in a very, very wealthy set. What happened to her is she was born in 1921, although, as I said, for decades she would claim it was 1923. And she's the product of a bad match between a very ambitious actress and a not very successful car salesman. The marriage has really gone kaput even before she's born. As soon as she is out of diapers, her mother parks her with relatives in Bethesda. In fact, the house that she lived in 6 very unhappy years, yearning for her absent mother, is next door to our colleague Dan Balls' house. And she is left, as her son Ron told me, these years just cast this permanent shadow on her spirit. She's anxious for the rest of her life. She's insecure for the rest of her life. She is always convinced that no matter how successful they are, no matter how good things are going for them, the bottom could drop out at any moment. And that seems to be confirmed for her 2 months into her husband's presidency, when she almost loses him to an assassin's bullet. She's, he's much closer to death than they let the country know at the time. It's one of the reasons why she turned to an astrologer. I mean, both Reagans had always been sort of interested in astrology. But Ronald Reagan actually had a religious faith. He believed that God had spared him because God had a purpose for him, and that gave him a kind of peace. She did not have that kind of faith, and she is just desperately grabbing for anything that could give her some kind of sense of control, because she is so convinced that anytime he leaves the White House, there is someone else out there who is waiting to finish off the job that John Hinckley tried to do. She's obsessed by the fact that presidents who are elected in years that end in zero tend to die in office. So she does kind of these nutty things, like she, having an astrologer. What could be less secure than for the president's security than to turn over the timing of his movements to a woman in San Francisco who Nancy Reagan herself has barely ever met? I mean, she develops, starting in the 1950s, but it becomes pretty serious after the assassination attempt in the White House, a dependence on prescription drugs that is serious enough that it is of concern to not one but two White House physicians. I mean, she really is, she spends her whole life just sort of this bundle of anxiety, which really does go back to her childhood. I mean, to give her mother credit, Edith Davis finally comes and retrieves her. She says, I'm getting married. I've met this neurosurgeon in Chicago. Her mother really gives you the model that the Reagan marriage would follow, because even though her father was a very successful, brilliant man of medicine, that wasn't going to propel them up in society. It was really Edith's networking that does that. But even then, I mean, she's an outsider in her own house. She has to engineer her own adoption when she is a teenager by Loyal Davis, who she reveres, who is the second most important man in her life, ultimately. As a 14-year-old, she has to go out and pull the papers together and present them to her biological father and ask him to sign this, relinquishing his rights to her. It's just, she was always insecure.
Except with Ronnie.
Except with Ronnie.
Yeah. I want to get to two, where there's so much substance in terms of her role as First Lady, but because you came prepared with some things, I want to get to one of them. One of the things that she's best known for substantively, and perhaps ironically, given her own reliance on prescription drugs, is the Just Say No campaign. Was that, how did that come about? Was it just sort of silliness of a slogan, or did it really help deal with a growing problem in America?
So Just Say No is something that grows up after the end of her husband's first year in office, which is swallowed by her anxiety over the assassination attempt, but also she's just made one big error after another. Polls are showing her the least popular First Lady in the history of polling, and they realize she's going to have to go out and at least look like she's doing stuff for other people. But I do think that Just Say No was a cause she truly believed in. I mean, she was on the road constantly pitching this. Now, it is easy to sort of shrug it off and say, oh, that was just family-friendly cover for the Reagan administration treating, and they did. They treated the drug problem as a law enforcement problem, not a health problem. They were cutting the social programs for treatment and prevention. But Just Say No is...
Their own kids were doing drugs.
Right, and their own kids were doing drugs. There was that. But Just Say No was really aimed at elementary school children. And so I was looking for something that could tell me whether it really made any difference. And I found, and people keep asking me about this, so for once I actually brought the numbers. There's something called the Monitoring the Future Project. It's funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse. And it has been surveying the attitudes of kids about drugs since 1975. And in 1979, more than 54% of high school seniors said they had used an illicit drug in the past 12 months. By 1992, that number had fallen by nearly half. And their attitudes shifted just as dramatically over the same period, where only a third of high school seniors in the late 1970s said they would disapprove of a friend trying marijuana. That percentage had more than doubled by the 1990s. So, this use of peer pressure, family pressure, to just change the acceptability. And then in the 1990s, you see the numbers go right back to where they were in the 1970s. And I also talked to Joe Califano, no Republican. He was Jimmy Carter's he was Jimmy Carter's HHS secretary and LBJ's chief domestic policy advisor. And he was the founder of the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse at Columbia University. And he told me it was a great message. It was simple and it was clear and it was what you wanted kids to do. It also sent a message to parents. This is what you should be telling your kids. And ultimately, Califano puts Nancy Reagan on his board. So yes, you can say it was just camouflage for a lot of policies, the incarceration of a lot of men who were disproportionately men of color. But I do think that at least in the period of the 80s, you do see young people's attitudes towards drugs and specifically marijuana shifting.
And she also played an important role in another health crisis of the Reagan administration, which was the AIDS epidemic that began and was dealt with not always appropriately by Ronald Reagan. Would you talk about her role there,
and
please?
before I say anything, let us stipulate that the way the Reagan administration dealt with AIDS is and will always remain one of the deepest scars on its legacy. He didn't even say the name of the disease until his second term in office, by which point tens of thousands of people had died of it. But she did recognize earlier than he did, again, she's the daughter of a doctor, that this is a real health crisis out there. Her son, Ron, is dancing in New York. He's with the Joffrey Ballet. He's part of the arts world. He's seeing it up close. And so Ron told me that slowly they would sort of try to Nancy could see problems abstractly. Ronald Reagan needed to put a face to them. He gets it with Rock Hudson. But they would try to sort of move him privately into a different space. But most of the people in the Reagan administration were social conservatives who thought this wasn't a health problem, this is a morals problem. William F. Buckley actually wrote a column suggesting that HIV positive people should be tattooed on their buttocks if they were gay and on their arms if they were IV drug users. I mean, this is an acceptable argument at the time. Ultimately, though, Reagan is going to have to give his first speech. I have an entire chapter on it. She will not allow the West Wing to write the speech because it had until recently been run by Pat Buchanan, and some of the things he wrote about AIDS sufferers were just horrifying. She goes out, recruits her own speechwriter. The speech is not perfect, but I was able in the library to see the arguments that were going on around the speech, the memos. The speechwriter told me he was able to win arguments with Reagan. Had never even met Everett Koop, his Surgeon General, on the subject of AIDS. And so there are massive arguments going on as to what this speech would say. And Landon Parvin, the speechwriter, told me when I could win an argument just by saying, this is what the First Lady wants. And when Reagan finally belatedly appoints a high-level commission to look at the epidemic and how the administration has handled it, it became known as the Watkins Commission. It is Nancy Reagan who insists that there be at least one openly gay expert on this commission. And that was a very, very controversial thing to do at the time. Gary Bauer, Senator Gordon Humphrey of New Hampshire are saying things like, this should not be an administration that gives people jobs based on their bedroom habits. Again, looking at this from 2021, it's almost impossible to believe that people would talk like that in public, but they did. So she was a force. She was not as aggressive, perhaps, as she should have been. It remains a scar on Reagan's legacy, but I was able to see what was going on internally, and it was pretty revealing.
I want to make sure that we leave time for questions,
Okay.
but I really need to squeeze in two more of my own. The first is the book starts, obviously, as you mentioned, with the Schultz dinner. And it talks about something that we never, I don't think, even understood about Nancy Reagan. When I think about Nancy Reagan and the Soviet Union, I think about her relationship with Raisa Gorbachev, which you chronicle so perfectly. Why? But she played a role that we didn't understand at the time, or perhaps until your book, in terms of promoting that rapprochement and détente. Why was that? Talk about that a bit, and why was that your opening scene? And did you know it was your opening scene, writer-to-writer question, from the moment that Schultz told you that story?
No, I had written the whole book sweating, how the heck am I going to get into this book? And then it was only after I finished writing the rest of the book that I realized Schultz had given me the keys to the kingdom here. My friend Ann Blackman, who's sitting there in the second row, got to watch up close. She was in Moscow for at the time as a reporter, and got to watch up close the Raisa Nancy relationship, which was difficult.
Yeah.
So, and I start the book not with my own words, but with those of Lou Cannon, a legendary Washington Post reporter who is the world's expert on Ronald Reagan. And his words were about her was, Reagan always knew where he wanted to go. She had a better sense of what it was going to take to get there. And so she was pushing for him. They would have big arguments over the fact that Reagan had called it an evil empire. And it's somebody in the book who was having dinner with them and witnessing just Nancy going after him on, why could you say that? But it wasn't because she had some grand geostrategic sense. It was because she wanted this to be her husband's place in history. She had a better understanding of what her husband's thoughts were, that a man who had so many decades of anti-communist rhetoric, in fact, also there existed a strain of idealism that he believed it was in fact possible to have a world without nuclear weapons. And he was a very strong believer in the biblical prophecy of Armageddon. It was partly what she wanted for him, and it was partly because she understood him better than a lot of the people around him did.
Perfect segue to what I promise is my final question before we open it up to others, which is that relationship was so close. And so I read it and I thought, wow, is this a relationship that I want to aspire to? Or is there something kind of creepy about it in there? I mean, especially when you read these letters, letter after letter, that I wanted to show them to my husband and say, try this, that Ronald Reagan, not that he's not loving, that Ronald Reagan wrote to Nancy. And yet the flip side of that, as you alluded to, was the exclusion, as Patty Davis said, of the children, in particular the children of Jane Wyman, but even her own biological children, from this relationship. I almost wondered if that expression that maybe that she hoped they understood, or that maybe she had failed, I wondered if she kind of even meant that, if she did really experience that in the painful way that kind of normal mothers would experience it, or if their relationship was just so unitary and so exclusive that it couldn't admit anybody else.
I think it is more the latter. And Ronald Reagan was a very remote figure. You know, he wasn't Bill Clinton with a Rolodex that would go out that door. You know, he wasn't Donald Trump constantly. In fact, he writes quite eloquently, but it would take somebody asking him to make a phone call for him to make a phone call. And really all he wanted, you read his diary and it's like every single passage is just suffused with his love for her. But again, to the exclusion, and he was her stability. And they really make a lot of mistakes with all four of their children. And Patty wouldn't talk to me, Michael wouldn't talk to me, but both of them had written tell-all scorching books about them. Ron was incredibly insightful, and Maureen's widower, Dennis Rebell, was also really, really helpful because he also was the living link to Jane Wyman. So all of that, you know, and again, so I have to just sort of keep coming back in the book over and over again to this.
And did you end up envying their relationship or being put off by it?
Well, so like there's decades of letters where he refers to her as Mommy Poo Pants, and they called each other Mommy and Daddy.
Kind of weird given her
He
absence of momminess.
And he called his own mother by her first name, Nellie. So I don't know that I could have or would have wanted to have. My husband, of course, dared me to title the book Mommy Poo Pants. And then he comes back with his alternate title, Backseat Driver, at which point I said, no more suggestions from you.
All right, I could go on, but I promised I'd stop. And also, I think I'm gonna do my best to do this without my reading glasses. First question, and a very good one. Did Nancy have any influence on Reagan's decision to name Sandra Day O'Connor as the first woman on the Supreme Court, or more generally on promoting women to official positions? Excellent question.
I don't really think so. And I think that a lot of the women who worked in the Reagan White House found her very difficult. She had a big, close circle of friends, but again and again, you sort of find that, and Ron, their son, told me, I just think my mother was harder on the women around my father than the men. So, and I did not ever find her fingerprints on Sandra Day O'Connor either. It's so funny because she was so rejected everything about feminism. And yet, and at one point, Katharine Graham, the owner of the Washington Post, they're talking about the fact that most of the most negative stories written about her are being written by younger women journalists. And Katharine Graham says to her, don't you see? You represent everything they're rebelling against. So while she would have rejected the label, I've come across very few people who are so comfortable in their own power as Nancy Reagan.
Well, and it's really a paradox because, and I'm wondering, we've seen our friend Susan Page wrote a really wonderful biography of Barbara Bush. There's a very good biography by a friend of mine, Julia Zweig, about Lady Bird Johnson and obviously the triumph, that is the triumph of Nancy Reagan. Is this in the modern world, when we are going to have a first gentleman one of these days, and when even the first lady is now working, she's Dr. Biden, she's not simply exercising power behind the scenes, and we think about the exercise of power by women so differently. Is this a book about a role that has now become archaic, or do you think that the first lady or first spouse is going to continue to be a fascinating example and subject for historians and writers in the future?
Well, it's such a fraught role. I mean, it doesn't have a job description, it doesn't come with a portfolio. Each of them has to sort of make it their own, depending on the needs of the spouse, on the moment in history in which they find themselves, on their own passions. But one thing that is true, and a lot of them have learned this the hard way, is that when the word powerful is used about a first lady, it is never intended as a compliment. And in many ways, I think the heart of my book is the Iran-Contra chapter, where she almost single-handedly runs the rescue effort that saves her husband's presidency, all the while pretending she's not. And I came across one passage. Richard Neustadt is probably the preeminent presidential scholar ever. He advised every Democratic president from Harry Truman to Bill Clinton. He founded the Kennedy School at Harvard. And his texts on presidential power continue to be studied. But he wrote of her, she said that she had a good ear and a fine eye. Her husband's close associates, however valuable or liked or even loved, were to be sacrificed in her view from the moment their continuation on the scene could compromise the president's public relations. When it came to people, her targets seemed well chosen, aim unerring, and timing right for someone who must wait for someone else to pull the trigger. And he also writes that every president would be well advised to follow this principle: never let your Nancy be immobilized.
Well, and they all, I mean, it's such a characteristic of presidents. And you talked about how he's different from Clinton, saying Clinton had this compulsive need to reach out to people. Ronald Reagan had the opposite. But every president almost has a compulsive need to be liked and an aversion to being the assassin. And so the assassin, the personnel assassin, turns out to be, and the tougher one often turns out to be, I think, the first lady. And we saw that time after time with Nancy Reagan. And elaborate on the Iran-Contra role, because it's so fascinating. She edges him to the moment where he has to fess up.
He again, Ronald Reagan, I didn't do anything wrong, this is all going to turn out fine. He's the consummate optimist. She has looked at the fact that the Senate has just the day after the first Iran-Contra revelations come out is the 1986 election. The Senate flips to the Democrats. Impeachment is a real possibility here. Certainly investigations are. She starts pushing for a complete overhaul of the White House staff, starting with getting rid of his chief of staff. He won't go for it. They are having raging arguments over this.
I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but this was so fascinating to me, because from the outside, when all we saw was adoring Nancy gazing, and even understanding that she was a tough player behind the scenes, and it was known at the time that she was going after Don Reagan. The fact that actually they did have normal couple arguments, he's telling her, get off my back.
It's Jim Coon, who was the White House counsel at the time, but Jim Coon, who was the executive assistant, which means he's always in the room. He goes to Camp David with them every weekend. He's sitting there doing his work in a little desk in the pantry in the kitchen at Camp David, and the Reagans are just going at it in the living room. And he hears Ronald Reagan scream at her, and he's told me this was louder than he had ever heard any human voice say, get off my goddamn back. And she just won't let go of it. So then she decides to sort of bring in other people. And Don Reagan, the chief of staff, would pick up the phone, and he'd hear her voice on the other end of the line going, oh, Don, are you still here? But ultimately she wins. But then there's something even more important that she has to do, which is for the first time in this scandal, which involves selling arms to our enemy, Iran, as basically ransom payments for hostages, an illegal diversion of funds to rebels in Nicaragua, something Congress has specifically banned. And Reagan keeps saying, oh no, that wasn't what I was doing at all. I don't think anybody's ever shown he even knew about the illegal diversion of the money, but he certainly knew that he was paying ransom for hostages. And for the first time, the country believes that Ronald Reagan, who won 49 states in the 1984 re-election campaign, is not being straight with them. So Nancy, he's going to have to give a televised speech where he speaks to the country, really, for the first time. She once again is not willing to trust this speech to anybody in the West Wing, most of whom are protecting their own hides at the time, because people could and would go to prison for this. She once again recruits Landon Parvin to do the speech. She does something that probably would be viewed as pretty close to the unethical line. John Tower has run the investigative commission. She sneaks him into the White House. There's a semi-secret tunnel that goes from the bottom of the Treasury building into the East Wing. Landon Parvin gets there. Reagan's top political advisor, a guy named Stu Spencer, is there. They're the only two living people who were in the room for this. But Nancy has John Tower lay out for the president how deep the trouble that he is in. Tower tells him, you should get your own lawyer for this. And Tower, a Republican former senator from Texas, is so distraught by having to deliver this news to the president that he at one point starts sobbing. And Reagan does something incredibly gracious at that moment because Tower has run the investigation. Reagan gets up and thanks Tower for his service to his country. And it is at that moment that Parvin knows that Reagan is finally at a spot where he will say the words that the country needs to hear, which is that in my heart, I didn't think this was what I was doing, but now that I look at this Tower Commission report, I have to accept the reality of what I did. The speech is hailed by Johnny Apple of the New York Times as the most important mea culpa since the Kennedy Bay of Pigs speech. Reagan's numbers go up 9 percentage points overnight, and it really is the speech that saves his presidency. And again, the whole thing was engineered by Nancy, including going out and recruiting the outsider who would write it rather than trusting anybody around her husband to do it.
So the final question is one that looks both back and forwards. What is your favorite? Who is your favorite person from the book, and what is your next project?
If anybody has any ideas for a next project, I would love to hear them.
Do you want to write another book?
Not right away. I still feel like I'm in the room, so I don't know what I want to name my second child yet. One of our colleagues has already done that, and I somehow think it wouldn't be quite as interesting. And so my favorite person in the book may have been Stu Spencer, who was the political consultant who guided Reagan's career from the beginning to the end. And I spent so many hours with him. Again, he's in his 90s, totally sharp, hilarious, great memory. The person I may be most indebted to, though, is Jim Kuhn, who was the executive assistant, as I said, always in the room. People had initially warned me. They had said, he's not going to tell you anything. I did an interview with him. It was fine for a couple of hours. Then about 6 weeks later, he calls me up and he says, we need to talk again and bring your tape recorder. It is, I think, a number of people who were willing to tell stories because they understood that if they don't do them now, these will forever be lost.
And what changed him, do you think?
I have no
Your
idea.
charm.
That was it.
Your knowledge, I mean.
But he loves the book. And you know, again, he just had a photographic memory of it. And he was always just the guy in the room. And he was a very young, you know, late 20s, early 30s person at the time.
Ruth, can I just say something with you? Having covered Nancy Reagan throughout much of her time in the White House, and Karen told me she was going to do this book, I just kind of groaned to myself, like, oh my God, she was so difficult, and you know, and when I read the book, I was just knocked over by the detail and nuance and kicked myself for not having known more. And having read both the Lady Bird Johnson recent bio and the Nancy Pelosi one, people who I generally have more feeling for, I mean, this book is so much better. Karen really did a great job.
That is an excellent point to end on. Thank you, Anne.
I would agree. And I think if you haven't read it, you absolutely should. We have some copies here that you would be happy to sign. And I thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
It was so much fun.
So much fun. Thank you so much for doing it. Now go buy things.
Thanks for bringing up the
I am.